By 1840, America had been independent from the British for 3 generations. Here we have the west coast of America, and here we have the east coast of America. Here we have the Rocky Mountains, and here we have the smaller Appalachian Mountains. Now, in 1840, the United States of America, which had developed from the original 13 colonies, was based on the east of America. We had here the permanent Indian frontier. Now, over here we had the plains, or the Great American Desert as they called it at the time, because they thought there was nothing there that anyone could want. But on these plains lived the Plains Indians, or the Red Indians, or the Native Americans, whatever you wanted to call them. In their teepees, they're nomadic people. They'd follow the buffalo herds around, and these buffalo would provide the Indians with everything they needed. They provide them with food, they provide them with the skins to make their teepees, they provide them with their arrowheads. So incredibly essential to Plains Indians' way of living. Also, you had the warrior bands, the young people who gained honour by going and hunting these buffalo. They're also very spiritual people. They believed in the Great Spirit, Wakantanka. They had ceremonial dances like the Sun Dance and the Buffalo Dance. And so they wandered around the plains. There are various tribes, but our course focuses mainly on the Sioux, which is towards the northern plains. Now, in the 1840s, the government began to worry about the Mexicans in the south here coming and taking the plains, I mean the British who had Canada in the north coming and taking the plains, and they wanted to push across what they thought was their manifest destiny. God wanted them to push across the plains. And at the same time, and probably influenced by this, you had groups of people who were known as the pioneers. Now, they had heard stories from mountain men who had gone to the Rockies to hunt for beaver pelts and come back with the pelts, and stories of a beautiful land over here in Oregon and in California, where the rivers were full of fish and the leaves were, the trees were full of oranges with which to make lovely Tropicana orange juice. And so, because in the East there'd been an economic depression in 1837, because it was cold, because people felt overcrowded here and they felt a sense of adventure, many in their wagons, pulled by oxen, crossed the plains. Now the journey was very treacherous. There were rivers that could flood, they could be attacked by Indians, they could get diseases like camp fever, and especially going over the Rockies as well was very treacherous. People like the Donner Party had to resort to cannibalism because they got stuck, not in the Rockies, in this area of Bernards, but stuck in mountains. There was then here a desert which they needed to cross, which they, of course, they suffered from dehydration before they either went to Oregon in the north or California in the south. Now, some of these settlers here in 1849 discovered in the hills above San Francisco gold sparkling in the hills, and this led to an even greater migration of people across the plains, known as the 49ers, who went to dig for gold. Now clearly when most of the later ones turned up, it had all gone, and these mining towns which quickly came up from nowhere, where dens of iniquity, where there's gambling and drinking, and huge hardship by these people who came to find nothing. But once the gold was gone in these hills, the rest of the story of the West is about gold being found in other places in the West, and these communities moving. Also during the 1840s, a religious group called the Mormons, who suffered a lot of persecution as they moved about in the East. They believed they were chosen people waiting for the second coming of Jesus Christ. They suffered so much persecution, and when they came up with the idea of polygamy, of having more than one wife, which was an idea shaped by the Indians, they decided they'd just get out of the East and go and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So they headed across the plains to a place called Salt Lake in the middle of the desert. There were salt flats, nobody wanted to live there. And they began their own new community called Salt Lake. city. There we are. So, so these are what we call the early pioneers crossing the plains. They was actually on the plains yet. But then, in the 1860s now, down here in Texas, there was a great trade in farming of Texas longhorn cows. Now, when the Civil War broke out, American Civil War broke out in the early 1860s, when the northern states fought the southern states, a lot of soldiers from Texas went to fight, leaving their longhorns alone. But when they came back, they found that the longhorns had been breeding. And so there were tens of thousands, if not millions, of longhorns in Texas. And they thought, well, what are we going to do with these cows? At the same time, to try and link these communities in the east with the communities in the west, the government had started, had sponsored 2 companies to build a railroad across the plains. And again, this was very difficult, crossing the rivers and being attacked by Indians, building railways through the mountains, and also getting enough labour, because it's a very dangerous job, and they had to employ many Chinese people to come and do the work for them. But finally, the 2 railroads, one was being built from the east, one being built from the west, managed to meet up at a place called Promontory Point. Now, the cattlemen down here saw the railways, and they thought, well, we could actually drive our cows up to the railroads, and then the railroads could take the beef to the west, where people loved their burgers and their steaks and stuff. And so these cattlemen began to drive their cows up onto the plains. Now, some of them, like a man called John Illiff, realised that actually, instead of going up and down every year, why not just drive one up onto the plains and let them breed? And so you had the start of the open range with cattlemen and cowboys settling on the plains. At the same time, the government, keen that more Americans settled here to stop the Mexicans and stop the British, they announced a Homestead Act. So if you farmed a piece of land for 5 years, you could have a 160-acre plot absolutely free. So these homesteaders, again driven by poverty, the Civil War ended, so lots of soldiers wanted a new start. Slavery had been abolished, lots of slaves wanted a new start. They came out onto the plains, what they had previously thought as unfarmed land. They developed lots of new methods of farming, like dry farming and getting water pumps to pump water out of the ground. They built sod houses for themselves, but eventually planted more trees and built wooden communities. They got together as communities and got school marms out to teach their children. And so slowly these homesteader communities grew. Now, as you can see, this caused a bit of conflict because the cattlemen were still driving their cows across homesteader land. So this did create tensions between the homesteader communities and the cattlemen. And this led to problems of law and order which were happening anyway, because all of these communities sprung up so quickly that the government over here in the west didn't know what to do. They didn't have sheriffs and people to enforce law and order. Now, the poor Indians, as you can see, are being slowly forced off the plains, and this leads to a series of conflicts. There's Red Cloud's War, for example, when gold is discovered in the Montana hills, and miners start going to get it. And Red Cloud, who's a Sioux leader at the time, begins to attack these settlers. It leads to prolonged conflict, which ends in stalemate. But Red Cloud agrees that the Sioux will have one big bit of land called the Great Sioux Reservation, which all of the Sioux can go on and hunt buffalo, and no white man is allowed. But then that includes the Black Hills, which was sacred land to the Sioux. But General Custer of the American Army took an expedition into the Black Hills and found gold there. And this led to a conflict between the Plains Indians and the Sioux. Now, Custer suffered an embarrassing defeat. In fact, he died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But this led to the American government wanting revenge for that. And so they sent a large force onto the plains, forced the Plains Indians onto the reservation, and slowly they began to make the reservation smaller and smaller and smaller. They sent buffalo, they sponsored buffalo hunters, gave them ammunition to go onto the plains to hunt the buffalo for their hides, and practically exterminated all of the buffalo in North America. So the Plains Indians, with nothing to live off, having to live on reservations, being forced to farm, their children being forced to go into Christian schools, their way of life was slowly eroded. So by the 1890s, as you can see, the Plains Indians What's left of them are tiny reservations, and the plains is now populated by homesteaders, ranches, and communities out in the